Okay, it's great to hear Liz's testimony earlier, and I think we'll see just some relevance to that as we look at that passage from Ecclesiastes as we go through. But let me begin by reading to you an advertisement for hedonism. Welcome to hedonism. Sleep in, stay up late, give up counting calories, have a drink before noon, give up mineral water, dine in shorts, talk to strangers, don't make your bed, go skinny dipping. Sounds like being a university student, doesn't it? Don't call your mother, let your hair down, don't pay for anything, don't leave a tip, be your beautiful self in spectacular Negril or Runaway Bay, Jamaica. Hedonism is a sandbox for your inner child, nourishment for the mind, soul, body and spirit. Pleasure comes in many forms, choose one, or two, or more. And with absolutely everything included in one upfront price, you never have to think about money, not even tips. Just what to do next, and when, and with whom. At one of two hedonism resorts to choose from, the original Hedonism 1 in Negril and the new Hedonism 3 in Runaway Bay. Well, there you go. That's the website description for Hedonism, which is a tourist resort in Jamaica. And the Hedonism Delight package is yours for a mere £2,100, flights extra, leaving this weekend. Check it out. I think the most telling part... I should get a commission. That would be good, wouldn't it? I think the most telling part of that description of hedonism is when it talks about hedonism is a sandbox for your inner child, nourishment for the mind, body, spirit, and soul. And whatever the pros and cons of that particular tourist resort, and I haven't tried it, let me tell you that, that is often the way that we're encouraged to seek pleasure, isn't it, at any cost. A return to the delights of childhood, when there were no responsibilities, and where our memories often want to tell us that life was one long game. Ninja maybe, I don't know, but one long game, where pleasure without any constraints is the means by which we feed our mind, our body, our spirit, and our soul. And over the centuries, that's been the apparent attraction of a life of pure pleasure. Hedonism. Our contemporary culture delights in pleasure seeking, but it's certainly not the first to do that, is it? Philosophically, hedonism has a long history, including the Epicureans in ancient Greece, and people like John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham in the Enlightenment period. I say one of my favourite places, I visit India quite frequently, and one of my favourite places in India is a deserted city called Fatehpur Sikri. It's about 40 kilometres away from Agra and the Taj Mahal, which in itself is pretty beautiful. But it comprises the most wonderful palace area. It's a deserted area now, but it's a beautiful palace area with gardens, with beautiful buildings, a palace for each of the emperor's 3 wives, one Muslim, one Christian, one Hindu, a harem, which originally had a whole series of curtains hanging where the emperor could play hide and seek with his concubines, and a beautiful pool of water with an island in the middle of it where musicians would sit and play to delight the emperor and his court. It is the most beautiful place, I have to say. And it's a testimony that pleasure seeking is not a new phenomenon, but it's an age-old desire in the hearts of human beings. And that is exactly what the writer to Ecclesiastes in Ecclesiastes is telling us, isn't it? The writer in Ecclesiastes, most likely Solomon, King Solomon, was carrying out an experiment. He wants to find out the meaning and purpose of life. And so through the course of the whole book, he tries a variety of different approaches. And in this particular passage, he explores whether true meaning and true significance in life can be found in seeking pleasure, in hedonism. That's what he says in the first verse. He says, I said to myself, come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what is good. And what follows in the passage that Amy read for us, what follows is a list of areas where he sought pleasure and sought to find some kind of meaning and purpose in pleasure. And we're no different. And so what I want to do is look, first of all, very quickly at each of those areas mentioned in that passage. But before I do that, I just want to say this, that pleasure is not wrong. Okay, as we look at this passage, don't get the idea that pleasure is wrong. Each of these areas of pleasure is kind of really positive in its own right. What the writer here is trying to do is to find ultimate meaning to life in pleasure alone. And sometimes we can get caught in exactly the same trap, can't we? There are plenty of people who look for meaning in life in seeking pleasure alone, people for whom their whole purpose in living is defined by their leisure pursuits or by pleasure in one form or another. So, how do people look for meaning in pleasure? Let's just look very quickly at those 6 areas and then we'll say something about them to finish. First of all, what I call the fun factory. If you've got a Bible in front of you, verse 2 just covers that. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? Laughter is a great gift, isn't it? It's a source of delight and joy, but it's not always as satisfying as we think. And I guess what this represents is that sense of just seeking fun for the sake of it, to the exclusion of everything else. There are 2 problems. One of the problems, of course, with laughter and fun in that sense is when laughter comes at the expense of other people. There's a difference, isn't there, between laughing with someone and laughing at someone. We all know that, don't we? In our own experience. We know when somebody's laughing with us, and we know only too well when they're laughing at us. And it may be that the writer here in Ecclesiastes has that kind of cruel edge to laughter in his mind. We see it on television, don't we, where our pleasure and our enjoyment in laughter is often at the expense of somebody else who's the butt of the joke, who's abused and mocked and potentially even hurt by our laughter. And so our pleasure can come at the expense and the damage and the hurt that's done to other people. But there's also, isn't there, a thin line between laughter and tragedy. I don't know if when you were at school you read Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. But if you did, then there's a kind of figure in Twelfth Night, a guy called Malvolio, who is a figure of fun. And he falls in love effectively with the wrong person. And he's then encouraged in that by his so-called friends. In the end, at the end of the play, he's dressed in bright yellow socks because his friends tell him that will make him attractive. And Malvolio is effectively the butt of the jokes and becomes at the end of the passage the end of the play a very sad and tragic figure. It's interesting, the lives of many great comedians tell the same story, don't they? Tony Hancock, who's to my mind one of the greatest comedians of the last century, certainly, committed suicide after years of deep unhappiness. Robin Williams, who committed suicide relatively recently, said, "Do I perform sometimes in a manic style? Yes. Am I manic all the time? No. Do I get sad? Oh yeah. Does it hit me hard? Oh yeah." The comedian Kenneth Williams wrote in his diary that no one will ever know the emptiness in my life. So maybe the fun factory is not all it's cracked up to be, as the writer here discovers. Maybe it simply highlights some of the emptiness that's inside us so often. So the second one that he tries is the alcohol trap. And in verse 3, if you've got a Bible in front of you, I tried cheering myself up with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. Now, the Bible is not against alcohol. Let me just tell you that, just in case you're heading off for the bar after the meeting tonight. It's not against alcohol. Of course it's not. In fact, Paul in the New Testament encourages one of his team, Timothy, to take a little wine for his health. I'll make a note of that. But what is often condemned in Scripture is drunkenness. But what happens with alcohol is, in a sense, that classic demonstration of the hollowness of so much pleasure-seeking. It begins as a means of raising our spirits, of encouraging us. It develops into a means of escaping from reality, and it finally becomes an addiction that destroys us. That is true of so much pleasure seeking if we are not putting it in its right place within our lives. I've pastored a number of alcoholics over the years. Sad thing is that what often started as a means of finding some pleasure in difficult times becomes something that is impossible to stop. Then takes people's homes, families, and jobs, quite literally. And until people reach the very bottom, they will they'll not be able to do anything about it because they think they're in control, and no one else can help. And that's often the pattern with the desire for pleasure that becomes the central kind of motivation in our lives. But then Solomon here in this passage goes on to talk about homes and gardens, not the magazine, which is you will have seen on the shelves of Smiths and probably not bought it like me. But he talks about homes and gardens. Verse 4, he says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. And again, let me say, there is nothing wrong with having a nice house and a nice garden. And there's equally nothing wrong with not keeping your garden tidy, he says. What is interesting here is the way in which our modern culture has latched on to the idea that life is about location, location, location. There are so many television programs, aren't there, about buying the right house, moving to the right part of the world, building the dream home, and so on. And there are people who throw their whole life's energy into their homes, into their gardens, and that becomes their purpose for living. That somehow that is going to be the way in which they find purpose and meaning in their lives. It's interesting that Solomon, whose words are recorded here, spent actually more time building his palaces than he spent building the temple that he built for God in Jerusalem. Probably reflects some of the attitude of people in our modern culture, doesn't it? But widen that, I think the writer here has in mind the grand projects that people embark on, that consume their lives because they fear the emptiness that is underneath, the emptiness that would otherwise be revealed in their lives. So sometimes they're good community projects or charitable works and so on. But the question to ask is not, is this doing good work? But what motivates it? Why are we doing this? What is it that we're trying to discover or cover up in our lives? What are we trying to achieve? So often people are really trying to achieve is some sort of perpetual memorial to themselves. And then Solomon goes on to talk about what I'll call the power complex. Now, any of you that come to St. Bart's will know that I love the television programme The Apprentice. I am hooked, absolutely. But the more I watch it, the more amazed I am at the desire for power and the ruthlessness that drives people to gain power. The writer here speaks of having slaves and slaves born to his slaves. And I don't want to focus on slavery. I don't think anyone here has got slaves, as far as I know. If you have, come and talk to me afterwards. I think you need counselling. But there's a great deal here about the desire to have power over other people, isn't there? Power to demand that people serve us, the kind of power which gives us a buzz if we can kind of exercise that power. That sense of pleasure almost in exercising power over others. I guess all of us need to watch out, don't we, for our motivation in seeking positions of power and authority, whatever context we're in. And again, it's not those things are wrong, of course they're not. But we can find a certain level of gratification simply from exercising some kind of power over other people. I rather like to think that's why the television remote is a source of such tension in families. It's a symbol of power. But there is that sense, isn't there, of power as a means of finding gratification and pleasure and meaning and satisfaction in our lives. Then Solomon goes on, he talks about what I call retail therapy. And verse 7, he's talked about male and female slaves, and then he goes on, I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. Now I think what's going on first of all here is that sense, a desire to possess things. But I think there is more than that even. You see, we can gain significant pleasure simply in buying things, in amassing things for ourselves. And that's why people, when they're bored or depressed, so often go shopping. It's a pleasure we gain, isn't it, from acquiring possessions, be it shoes or clothes or books or electrical gadgets or the latest iPhone or whatever it is. The pleasure we get so often drives us to buy more and more and more. Of course, that's what's most damaging when poverty leads to depression and depression leads to people wanting to spend more, to exercise that sense of pleasure in acquiring goods. Oh, we can all point to the extreme cases, can't we? I don't know if you know, on one occasion Michael Jackson spent several £100,000 on essentially irrelevant items in 20 minutes in a department store. Hundreds of thousands of pounds in 20 minutes. But we can look at the extremes, can't we, and say, oh, well, I'm okay. But we need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, are we seeking pleasure? Are we seeking meaning almost in the gadgets that we buy and the things that we possess, that we cling on to? It's interesting, isn't it? Shopping is now a major family leisure pursuit. It's actually something you do as families, shopping. And we seek pleasure from accumulating things, whether we need them or not. And then the sixth and last of the things that Solomon picks up on here is sex rules. There in verse 8, where he talks about acquiring male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I want to pick up that reference to the harem. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, you may sit here and say, well, I'm okay then. That's all right. But there are plenty of people who put the pleasure of sex and relationships at the very centre of finding meaning in life. And it was great to have Liz's testimony earlier, just to kind of see that worked out in the reality of somebody's lives. And I suspect that Liz isn't the only person for whom that has been an issue, or maybe still is an issue. There are plenty of people who put the pleasure of sex at the very heart of finding meaning. Now, I have to say, God created sex. He's in favour of sex. He encourages sex in marriage between a husband and a wife. Sex is great. It is pleasurable, and I can assure you that as a married man. But the danger is when we put sex as the primary purpose for life, where it becomes in some way our identity, our meaning, our purpose. The internet and other media makes sex easily accessible, doesn't it? Whether we're in a relationship or not. It's like having access to millions of virtual concubines, basically. And like alcohol, it has the same power to engulf us, to trap us, to ultimately fail to deliver the pleasure that we actually desire and think it's going to deliver for us. What satisfies once will not satisfy the next time. So it has the potential to draw us further and further in and down with more and more extreme forms of practice or desire. And while on the surface, all these 6 forms of pleasure that Solomon mentions here are good, all of them have the potential to be abused and to abuse us, ultimately. So the writer here tells us they simply fail to satisfy. They become an end in themselves if we are seeking meaning and purpose within them. Just listen to what he says in verses 10 and 11. He says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. Doesn't it sound very contemporary? Written several thousand years ago, and yet it sounds so contemporary, doesn't it? I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This is the most extraordinarily wealthy man. This is the king of Jerusalem, the man who has 700 wives, 300 concubines, the man who owns an immense amount, the man who can have whatever he wants. And he says it was all nothing. It's meaningless, chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So why is it that pleasure promises more than it can deliver? Well, a couple of things as we draw to a close. First of all, it's about satisfying our senses. It satisfies our senses, but it does not satisfy our souls. The hedonism resort is wrong. Quite simply, hedonism may be the sandbox for your inner child. It may be nourishment for your body, but it does not refresh your spirit and soul. In fact, it has the potential even to damage those if we don't use pleasure rightly. We are material creatures. We have bodies, and God gives us senses to be stimulated. And it's right for us to enjoy good food and good drink. It's right for us to enjoy the beauty that is around us. It's true that we need things, and God provides for all that we need materially. It is true that sex is a gift from God, not just the way that we reproduce. It's to enjoy one another in right relationship. But of course, sex itself must be in the intimate relationship of a husband and wife in marriage. Has no place outside of marriage, has no place in other relationships, or even outside of relationships at all. And when we seek sexual pleasure outside of relationships, through pornography or whatever it is, it's focused on self, where God's purpose for sex is to give pleasure to somebody that we have committed ourselves to in permanent, lifelong covenant relationship. But in a sense, all these things, we've focused on that, but all these things are designed to satisfy the senses alone. And if we build our purpose and our meaning purely on sensual experience, death will rob us of that, won't it? Death will rob us of our sensual enjoyment. So that's the first problem. Second problem is it's putting self at the centre. So all these things put self at the centre. Even when we appear to be carrying out the grand projects that Solomon kind of talks about here, which benefit other people, so often the motivation is that we receive pleasure and gratification from doing them. Now, enjoying pleasure is not wrong in itself, but where the focus of our whole lives is on ourselves, not on others and not on God, then we have lost sight of the real need and purpose for which God gave us life in the first place. When we allow pleasure simply to define our lives, we miss the whole point of life, and we soon discover the emptiness underneath. And then thirdly, we're distracted from reality. Also, defining our lives by pleasure can simply be a way of distracting us from the reality of living and the reality of death. The writer here speaks of the few days of our lives. if you have no focus on eternity, if you have no assurance of eternal life with God, then suddenly these few days of life that we have, and they are few, aren't they? However old we live to, that they are few. These few days of life become very precious. And we're tempted then to follow the slogan, aren't we? Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If this life, if you like, is all that we have, then we want to make the most of it. We put ourselves at the very centre of it, don't we? And if we're an apprentice on the television show, we trample over everybody else to make sure that we get what we want. But if we know that we have to give an account for our lives, give an account for what we have put at the very centre of our lives, then that will change our focus significantly. It will matter whether we have made our own self-centred purpose or whether we have sought a purpose in life that is in line with the glorious purposes of the God who made us. We have to live in the real world. A bit of escapism is fine. Some people love to escape with Xbox. I love kind of action movies. Others it's music. For others it's sport. Whatever it is, that's fine. But we have to come back to the real world and face reality. And when reality is painful, as it often is, and again, as we've heard this evening, when reality is painful, simply escaping from reality is not good enough, is it? We need to trust that there is a God who is in control, and that suffering itself, the experience of real life, is the means by which God is working his glorious purposes out in the world he's created. And there's the dissatisfaction factor. Pleasure never delivers what it promises because our senses always demand more, don't they? We go shopping, we buy something great, and the next time it has to be something even greater. You know, the smartphone we buy this time, the next one's got to be even better than that, hasn't it? The holiday we went on was fantastic, but next time we're going to push a little bit further and go to something even better than last time. And we get so easily bored, don't we, as human beings? So easily bored. And the effect of some pleasures on our senses is to make us dissatisfied so that we constantly need to go further the next time. As one writer suggests, it's a little bit like salted peanuts. You have one salted peanut and you have to have the whole packet. I can identify with that. And when you finish the packet, you feel hungry for more, don't you? So pleasure simply does not satisfy in itself. And then, finally, it's chasing the wind. The writer says it's like chasing the wind. You actually never catch it. It's always elusive. We end up feeling empty, life feels meaningless, because we've chosen to chase something that, by its very definition, cannot satisfy the deepest part of us, our soul. Pleasure's not wrong in itself. And Solomon himself would want to acknowledge that. He enjoyed plenty of pleasurable pursuits. It's a source of great joy and delight. And God's people have always been encouraged to celebrate, to enjoy life, to party, to have joy, as we were hearing before. But that is not where true lasting satisfaction is found. Later on in Ecclesiastes, we get a final hint right at the end that actually it is a relationship with God that gives us true satisfaction. But let me take you somewhere else in the Bible just for a moment as we close to see what the Bible says about where true satisfaction, where true meaning and true purpose is found. I'm turning to the New Testament, to the letter to Timothy, first letter to Timothy in chapter 6. And Paul, who writes this, says this: "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Most people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, he says, writing to Timothy, you, man of God, flee from all that and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. Fight the good fight for the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called when you made your good confession in the presence of many witnesses. In the sight of God, who gives life to everything, and of Jesus Christ, who while testifying before Pontius Pilate made the good confession, I charge you to keep this command without spot or blame until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which God will bring about in his own time. God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see, to him be honour and might forever. In that passage, the writer Paul warns us about looking for purpose and meaning and satisfaction in the temporary things of life. Reminds us to find purpose and meaning and satisfaction and contentment in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who died for us in order that we might have real life, full life, now, but ultimately for the whole of eternity. What is this life? Is it just these few days, as Solomon puts it, that we have to live? 70 years, 80 years, 90 years? There was a cyclist killed on the Keynsham bypass this morning. I don't know how old he was. But we don't know how many few days we have, do we? What is life? Is it just these few days to be used and to be filled with pleasure? Or an eternal relationship with the God who created us with meaning and purpose, to know him and trust him and to experience pleasure in him and in relationship with him. Jesus himself said, I've come that you may have life in all its fullness. That's not just now, but for the whole of eternity. There's a Christian writer from America called John Piper, and he speaks of what he calls Christian hedonism. I'm sure how helpful the term is, but he talks about Christian hedonism. And in doing so, he reminds us that God created us to know him and also to enjoy him, to find pleasure in our relationship with God. That is where pleasure is ultimately found, in knowing God through his Son who died in order that we might have life. That is where our purpose and meaning is, and that is where body, mind, spirit, and soul are truly refreshed.